Motley Crue dominated the 80s, having all 5 of their albums from the decade going platinum. They concluded the decade with the biggest album of their career, 1989's Dr. Feelgood, a fresh start for the band considering many of them had battled severe substance abuse issues. But the following years would prove to be a turbulent time for the Crue as they were dealing with changing musical trends and infighting. The band either fired frontman Vince Neil or he left on his own accord, depending on what you read, in 1992. The Crue returned in 1994 with their self-titled album, a record that time seems to have forgotten, and their first and only album without Neil. But half a decade after Neil left, he was back in the fold, rejoining Motley Crue when they released their 1997 record Generation Swine, an album that's been universally panned. Today, let's talk about the record. Following the hugely successful album cycle for 1989's Dr. Feelgood, Motley Crue reassembled in the early 90s to begin work on their long-anticipated follow-up. But by February of 92, it was announced that frontman Vince Neil was out of the band. Depending on who you ask, he was either fired or he left by his own accord. His ex-bandmates issued a statement following Neil's departure that the frontman was done with rock and roll and pursuing his real love, which was racing and golf. Neil, however, responded filing a lawsuit against his former bandmates for $5 million, claiming wrongful dismissal, and there would also be legal battles over the rights to the band's name in addition to publishing money. The timing of the split couldn't have happened at a worse time for the group, who reportedly signed a deal worth anywhere between $20 million to $35 million with Elektra in September of 91. Despite the loss of Neil, though, many in the rock press believed that Motley Crue would still have enormous success without a frontman. The LA Times interviewed an editor for Rip magazine who said, "To me, it's obvious that Motley Crue is likely to do better because bassist Nikki Sixx is responsible for all the lyrics and co-wrote most of the music. Other than having the experience of being a frontman for an arena-level act, Vince isn't much of a proven talent." This was a sentiment echoed by others who likened it to when Van Halen parted ways with David Lee Roth in the mid-80s. Nikki Sixx revealed during an interview with the Wisconsin paper that the band contemplated possibly calling it a day once Neil left, but Sixx admitted that he changed his mind when he listened to a LA hard rock band called The Scream. Frontman for the group John Corabi saw the interview and got in touch with Motley Crue upon learning that Neil was gone, and soon enough he joined the band. Funny enough, Corabi admitted to the Arizona Daily Star that he didn't initially think he was a good replacement for Neil since their voices didn't sound very similar. He also admitted he wasn't a big fan of Motley Crue's music, but he added his attitude changed once they started jamming together. After just 3 jam sessions, the band had written their first song together, Misunderstood, which appeared on Motley Crue's subsequent album. The fact that Corabi also played guitar, bass, and drums only added to his appeal. Motley Crue credited the dismissal of Neil as allowing the band to write more relatable songs that dealt with harder subject matter, claiming all the band's past songs about women and partying were Neil's forte. Released in March of 94 and produced by Bob Rock, who worked on Dr. Feelgood, the group's new album came out nearly half a decade since their last release. The music scene had drastically changed. Soundgarden at the time had a #1 album, while groups like Pearl Jam and Stone Temple Pilots were enjoying widespread success. Motley Crue's self-titled album peaked at #7 on the Billboard album charts, but it only went gold, and it was a disappointment as all their previous records went platinum. They had a few singles, including Hooligan's Holiday and Misunderstood, that did chart, though. To support their self-titled album, the band downsized to playing smaller venues that seated only a few thousand people, when years prior they were playing to tens of thousands of people a night. But ticket sales were slow and their longtime fans were turned off by the band's new sound. Even MTV gave the group less attention. When the band got to work on their second album with Corabi, things didn't seem to work out. Corabi claimed years later that Motley Crue's self-titled record rattled his former bandmates' confidence when it came to recording its follow-up. Originally titled Personality No. 9, Corabi claimed that the changing musical landscape that gave rise to groups like Marilyn Manson, Nine Inch Nails, Rob Zombie, as well as Pantera, led to Motley Crue trying to follow in their footsteps. Motley Crue, wanting to shake things up, also fired their manager and hired Alan Kovac, who is well known for revitalizing bands' careers. The band initially brought in producer Bob Rock to produce their follow-up. Things seemed to be going well initially. After buying some time from their label, who pressured them to bring Neil back, the band was resistant to the suggestion. Corabi remarked how the band was really happy with the music they were working on, but then Bob Rock was off the project because he was too expensive, and His bandmates felt like he was overproducing the music. They soon brought in an inexperienced producer in Scott Humphrey, with Nikki Sixx and Tommy Lee co-producing the album as well. But the problem was that Humphrey butted heads with the band over musical and lyrical ideas. As a result, Corabi grew frustrated with the situation and started getting mixed signals in the studio telling Rob's School of Music. To be perfectly honest with you, I think they were panicked. It was the first time for Tommy and Nikki to actually really produce a record. They didn't know what they wanted. They would give me these random bands, like Nikki would say something on the lines of Manic Street Preachers and Old David Bowie. And then Scott would go Cheap Trick, and then Tommy would go, no dude, like Heavy, like Pantera, but lush like Oasis. And I'm sitting there like, half of these bands I've never heard of before. Ultimately, Corabi was let go, and it was the band's label who ultimately forced Motley Crue to get back with Neil. Neil was eventually brought back into the fold, and the band was adamant in the press that this was not a reunion, but rather the classic lineup getting back together and staying together for the long run. Corabi did end up being credited on 2 songs on their forthcoming record, but claimed he contributed to actually 80% of the album. He filed his own lawsuit against the band.
Someone tell me why.
The resulting album, Generation Swine, initially had Corabi's vocals on them, but Neil returned to the group and the band retooled the songs. Producer Scott Humphrey recalled in The Dirt, the songs weren't written towards Vince's singing style or even his range. Nikki wanted to be Nine Inch Nails one day, and U2's Zeropa the next. The resulting album had more computer programming and synthesizers, and Sixx and Lee also contributed lead vocals. Humphrey was also displeased with the band's lyrical choices, but he added that Nikki Sixx didn't like his lyrics being scrutinized, adding, there was this line in the song Glitter that went, let's make a baby inside of you. And I was like, there's no way. You can't put this line on the record. It was ridiculous, and he basically tried to say it was the best thing he'd ever written. The album was also notable because of the reimagining of the song Shout at the Devil. The idea came to the band a few years prior when a fan approached them backstage with a computer-altered version of the song. While they claimed the fans' version was terrible, it did plant the seed of an idea for the band going forward. According to Neil, they sped it up, changed the guitar parts, and updated it. As for how Motley Crue survived a changing musical landscape and trends, Vince Neil shed some light on how they outlasted a lot of the other hair bands from the 80s, as well as alternative acts from the 90s. According to Neil, he considered Motley Crue to be innovators and the first on the scene, whereas bands like Poison and Warrant weren't, and while they had big hits, their music was much more derivative. He stated the same for alternative rock bands of the 90s, adding, with the alternative thing, Pearl Jam came out in Nirvana, and all the other bands tried to emulate them. They had a couple of hit songs, but are gone now. I think it is what it is. We were first, we kept changing, and people kind of had to keep up with us. Do you guys agree with that statement? I don't know if I do. Commercially, the album charted at number 4 in its first week of release, but the following week it tumbled down the charts to number 30. While the band was gung-ho about the record when promoting it, years later, they definitely had different feelings about it. Neil admitted how much he hated the record, telling the San Francisco Gazette, I hated that record. I didn't want to do those songs. I didn't want to be there. I probably quit 5 more times while we were recording. It was a tough record to make. He added that he was restricted by the group's producer from singing in his typical style. Meanwhile, the subject of controversy was the role of guitarist Mick Mars. He told Eddie Trunk how it was a difficult era for him because the band was trying to reinvent itself. Mars also butted head with Humphrey, with him recalling how he'd play a guitar part and be told by the producer, that sounds too much like a guitar, with Mars replying, and I'm going, it is a guitar. It was said that session musicians had to be brought in for Mars on the album. The record produced 2 charting singles, and Afraid, which peaked at number 10, and Beauty, which peaked at number 37 on the Mainstream Rock Tracks chart.
She's so afraid of love. He's so mystified. She's so banal.
The songs on the album also took inspiration from Cheap Trick, with members Rick Nielsen and Robin Zander even contributing vocals to the album, and the 2 bands even toured together following the record's release. Like any album, it was a snapshot of what was going on in the members' lives. Tommy Lee, who was in a high-profile relationship with Pamela Anderson and had a child with the actress, wrote the song Brandon about his son. Nikki Sixx, meanwhile, penned the track Rocket Ship, which was a tribute to his wife Donna d'Errico.
She had candlelight and soul. Forget just who we are. It's Alice.
That does it for today's video, guys. Thanks for watching. We'll see you again on Rock and Roll True Story sticker.